שמי מנחם פיש, יש לי הכבוד והעונג לשבת ראש להרצאת האורח של פרופסור גלן דיינר, שהואיל בטובו להגיע במיוחד כדי להשתתף בכנס הזה. אבל לפני כן התנצלות בשמו של נשיא האוניברסיטה הפתוחה, פרופסור מצר, שלא היה יכול להיות איתנו, ולברך את באי הכנס. אם כן, זה כבוד והנאה מיוחדת להציג בפניכם את פרופסור גלן דיינר, שהוא פרופסור למדעי היהדות, Judaic Studies, איך שנתרגם את זה, וכן יושב ראש המחלקה למדעי הרוח בסרה לורנס קולג'. גלן דיינר כתב הרבה. אני רוצה להזכיר שני ספרים שלו בלבד. הספר הראשון יצא, שניהם פורסמו באוקספורד יוניברסיטי פרס. הספר הראשון ב-2006 שנקרא Men of Silk, The Hasidic Conquest of Polish Jewish Society, הכיבוש החסידי של פולין היהודית. והספר השני שיצא לי לשבת על האובניים, אם אפשר להתבטא כך, בעת הולדתו, פרופסור דיינר ואני זכיתי להיות עם פרופסור דיינר במכון ללימודים מתקדמים בפרינסטון ב-2010, בזמן שהספר השני שלו, שנקרא Yankel's Tavern, Jews, Liquor and Life in the Kingdom of Poland, נכתב. אם אני זוכר נכון, קראתי 3 פרקים, איך שהם ירדו מן המחשב שלו, בילינו תקופה נהדרת יחד, כשקוראים איש את הטיוטות של רעהו, ומדברים הרבה מאוד על, ולא רק מדברים, על יש טוב, ועל יהודים ועל פולין. מה שמייחד, אני חושב, את עבודתו של פרופסור דיינר, זה שהוא מייצג את הדור החדש והחשוב בחקר הדתות בכלל ובמדעי היהדות בפרט. במובן הזה, ואני חושב שכותרת הרצאתו היום מרמזת על כך, במובן הזה, או במובן של תובנת היסוד, שלמרות היומרה הפיוריסטית של הדתות השונות, אי אפשר להבין אף אחת מהן מבפנים באופן טהור. במילים אחרות, אי אפשר להבין את היהדות, אפילו לא תופעה כמו חסידות פולין, מבלי לקחת בחשבון את הדיאלוג הסבוך, הסמוי והגלוי, המודע והלא מודע, שהדת הזאת מנהלת עם סביבתה. ההיסטוריה הן של החסידות, אם לדבר על שתי העבודות הגדולות שלו, הן של התפתחות החסידות בפולין והן של ההשתלבות המדהימה של היהדות בכל התעשייה והמסחר של השיכר בפולין. אלה אפיזודות בהיסטוריה של פולין, הן אפיזודות באותה מידה בהיסטוריה של נצרות פולין. ואי אפשר לחקור את הפרק הזה בתולדות היהדות מבלי לקחת את זה בחשבון באופן עמוק. ולכן הרצאתו של פרופסור דיינר בכנס הזה היא כל כך מתאימה לסוג המרכז הזה שחוקר יחד את 3 הדתות המונותאיסטיות השלובות זו בזו, משוחחות זו עם זו, מגיבות זו לזו, כשכל אחת מהן בעצם משחקת תפקיד פורמטיבי בחיי שתי האחרות. פרופסור דיינר ידבר היום על Beyond Essentialism. זה בעצם תמצית של מה שאמרתי עכשיו. Beyond Essentialism, the case of Jewish-Christian Symbiosis in Eastern Europe. אני רק אוסיף עוד משפט. אני לא מכיר הרבה עבודות שכדי לחקור את תולדות החסידות בפולין נדרשות לחקור את תולדות המיסטיקה הנוצרית באותו זמן והאופן שבו הן משוחחות זו עם זו. אז without further ado, נעבור עכשיו לאנגלית, משום שפרופסור דיינר will speak in English. He will speak slowly in English. He has promised me that he will take questions in Hebrew. We'll leave it to him if he'll answer in Hebrew, but he'll take the questions in Hebrew. And again, it's an honor and a great personal pleasure to invite Professor Dynner.
Thank you very much. It's such an honor to be here with Professor Menachem Fish. Some of this work is, I think it's fair to say, the outcome of our long conversations together at the Institute for Advanced Study. And of course, I'd like to also thank Bat Zion and the committee and the Open University for this honor. In 1911, in his famous Jews and Modern Capitalism, Werner Sombart set out to explain why Jews were so formidable in the economic realm. The Jew, he explained to his readers, is sui generis, adaptable and mobile and constantly alive to new possibilities and ideas. But he's also cunning and deceitful because the Jew is historically a nomad. The Aryan, in contrast, is settled and virtuous, according to Sombart, and does not stand much of a chance in the marketplace against the nomad, the Jew. Scholars today refer to such theories as essentialist because such theories assume that Jews are different from non-Jews in their very essence. The responses of historians to Sombart's anxiety-provoking theory have varied. A few historians have tried to deny any indications of Jewish difference in the economic realm at all. But a more popular approach has been to basically uphold essentialism by giving it a kind of philo-Semitic or optimistic twist. Jewish economic overrepresentation becomes Jewish economic achievement, something to be admired rather than feared. Sombart's theory finds its most optimistic reincarnation in Yuri Slezkin's award-winning book, The Jewish Century, which asserts rather boldly that the modern age is actually a Jewish age. Because modernity is, quote, about everybody becoming urban, mobile, literate, and articulate, which are all Jewish qualities. To be successful in modernity, Slezkin concludes, we must all become Jews. Slezkin describes Jews as inherently urban, mobile, literate, mentally nimble, occupationally flexible, and offers impressive snapshots of Jewish economic predominance in various European settings as proof, without, however, pausing to think about the historical background or context of those impressive snapshots. Maristella Botticini and Zvi Eckstein's award-winning book, The Chosen Few, attributes Jewish economic success to the unique value that Jews placed on education, forgetting, however, that Jewish women, who are usually deprived of a formal education, were actually formidable and important in the economic realm, sometimes exclusive breadwinners of their families. A recent essay by David Hollinger bears the title Rich, Powerful, and Smart. Jewish overrepresentation in trade should be explained rather than avoided. Hollinger does not seem to really question his title's premise. What these works all seem to have in common is their acceptance of the notion of a Jewish essence, whether it be a scary nomadism or a more positive mental agility, a mercantile ethos, or a unique dedication to education. Such an essence is, however, extremely difficult to verify. In fact, these scholars seem to pay little attention to historical context at all and are probably mistaking nature for nurture. historical circumstances like the conditions of Jewish settlement, legal restrictions, privileges, kinship networks, and other contextual factors were probably more decisive than any cultural essence and need to be carefully and patiently explored. But even this would probably miss the most important point. What is most decisive in enabling a marginal group like European Jewry to secure an economic niche is not the reality, but the perception of that Jew's unique qualities and abilities. Dominant elites somehow come to believe that this group can fulfill certain economic functions better than any other group. Of course, the image must be backed up by competence, but it is the image that initially attracts elite patronage and protection, which in turn gives the marginalized group a competitive edge and a kind of mystique and scares off competition while keeping interethnic violence down to a minimum. Images can be well-deserved and can derive from concrete achievements over time, but images can also be deceptive and simplistic. Cases of interethnic symbiosis are particularly illuminating in this regard. These are economic relationships between in-groups and out-groups, because they often, majority groups do not form economic-based relationships with out-groups out of any sense of affection or altruism. In fact, they often display animosity towards one another. Symbiotic relationships are only formed as a result of a marginalized group's perceived indispensability, the perception, especially among dominant elites, that without this group's participation, trade and profits would be greatly impeded. That perception makes elites feel invested in the outgroup's physical safety and well-being. Such perceptions may have been stereotypes, but they underwrote entire systems of interethnic symbiosis. From the Middle Ages on, Duke Boleslav the Pious, King Kazimierz the Great, and numerous other nobles and kings in Poland, Lithuania, invited Jews from German-speaking lands where they were no longer considered economically necessary to come to Poland to settle, offering them attractive trade privileges and protections, however hedged in by restrictions against land ownership, all of which had the effect of steering Jews away from farming and agricultural pursuits and towards urban or urban-like pursuits, because Polish nobles and kings believed Jews to be better at these pursuits. Jews, in turn, were highly motivated to fulfill these expectations and often had to be more enterprising and litigious to overcome their hostile Christian competitors and those Christian competitors' allies in the government. But let us not get the order confused. Perceptions preceded reality, and those perceptions often would prove self-fulfilling. Several symbiotic systems emerged between Jews and Christian elites in Poland, Lithuania. The landowning nobility dominated the grain trade. They owned the vast majority of land. But they would often rent out space on their grain barges to Jews who would deal in secondary products like fur, forest products, wax, luxury items, which they would later distribute throughout the Polish-Lithuanian countryside. Nobles attempted to attract Jewish settlement to their towns and encouraged Jews to attend their trade fairs. And during the partitions of Poland and the Napoleonic Wars, several Jewish merchants became very prominent military suppliers, supplying the armies with things like leather and meat and even munitions sometimes. But by far, the most pervasive and intensely symbiotic occupation was Jewish leaseholding. Polish nobles owned the majority of land, but they didn't want to run the enterprises on those lands. They would lease out these enterprises, mills, fish ponds, tolls, and most predominantly taverns, to Jews. Such enterprises were profitable. The most profitable, however, were the taverns and distilleries. The nobles owned these taverns and distilleries on monopolistic terms, which meant that all the peasants living on their lands had to buy their vodka in their lord's tavern. And the nobility became convinced that only Jews could run taverns and distilleries profitably. So they leased those taverns and distilleries primarily to Jews. And by the end of the 18th century, about 85% of all taverns and distilleries were leased to Jews. And liquor was practically the entire economy. By this time, 3/4 of the world's Jewish population now resided in Poland, Lithuania, and among those Jews, around 40% were involved in the sale and production of vodka. Polish reformers complained that Jews had conquered all branches of trade, shut out the Polish townspeople, and had turned the peasants into drunks by dominating the lucrative liquor trade. Some claimed they were the only vital element economically in the kingdom. Such reformers were, of course, forgetting about the nobility, who actually owned the land, the taverns, the towns, the villages. But again, we are dealing with perceptions. Jewish-run taverns and distilleries became even more important after the loss of access to ports and the emergence of new borders and tariffs during the partitions of Poland. And here it's a little difficult to read the map, but by the end of the 18th century, in 3 stages, Poland-Lithuania was partitioned, devoured by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Russia takes the green parts, Prussia takes the blue parts, and Austria takes the yellow parts, so-called Galicia. The Russian portion comes to be known as the Pale of Settlement. So that is to say that Jews in Polish-speaking lands inhabit the Tsarist or Russian Empire in those formerly Polish lands with those Polish nobles as their overlords still. That western bulge comes to be semi-independent and known as the Congress Kingdom of Poland. Here's a slightly better map, and this contains increasingly important cities like Warsaw and Lodz, which is home to the textile industry at the end of the 19th century. Now, what happens is the partitions of Poland accelerate the decline of the grain export trade because new borders, new tariffs makes the cost of transporting the grain to places like Central and Western Europe prohibitively expensive. It costs more to transport than anything you could ever make profit-wise. And so what do you do with all that grain? The nobility turns it into vodka, which they sell to their own peasants by means of their Jewish lessees. These taverns were much more than taverns. They were hotels, they were restaurants, they were the only entertainment venues, they were stores. They were basically the center for news, in addition to places to drink vodka. The Jewish tavern keeper becomes integral to local life, presiding over Christian celebrations, dispensing advice, medical remedies, loans, and mediating relations between the peasants and the nobility. We are not talking about utopia, but Jewish-run taverns enabled an economic-based norm of coexistence that contrasts with the much more familiar picture of anti-Semitism and violence, which were episodes that punctuated a norm of day-to-day coexistence. The earlier situation of rough coexistence is depicted throughout Polish art and literature. For example, the most famous Polish epic poem, Pan Tadeusz, presents the Jewish-run tavern and Judaism itself as being etched into the landscape. From a distance, the rickety old tavern looked like a Jew rocking in prayer, the roof like a hat, the thatch spilling down like a beard, the sooty walls like a gabardine, the wood carvings emanating like tzitzis down his body. As the heroes enter Yankel's tavern, the name of the Jewish lessee of the tavern, we are treated to a scene of warm interethnic interaction, however, within very strictly prescribed roles. It was Sunday, and from church after morning mass, they came to Yankel's to drink and relax. In everyone's cup, gray vodka switched. Round with a bottle, the barmaid rushed. Yankel, the tavern keeper, stood in the midst. A kind of triangular symbiotic relationship had emerged in early modern and eventually modern Poland-Lithuania, with the nobility owning and selling the liquor through the Jew, who was a sort of captive service sector, to the peasant, who was the main customer for the vodka. Problem is, over time, by the 1820s, vodka distilling technology was becoming more advanced, and the stuff becomes a lot cheaper and a lot stronger, and what today we call alcoholism became an epidemic. And who do you think gets blamed? Having an outgroup like the Jews sell this highly intoxicated and addictive substance and profitable substance didn't look good. And it prompted Polish critics to accuse Jews of turning the peasants into drunks, exploiting them, and cheating them. And here we see an image that appeared in a Polish nationalistic periodical, where we have a satanic-looking Jewish tavern keeper, indifferent to the plight of the drunken peasantry around him. Throughout the 19th century, the absolutist monarchs who rule over the Polish lands begin to expel Jews from the countryside completely in order to do away with Jewish tavern keeping, and therefore, according to their logic, do away with drunkenness completely. The problem is, you expel 15,000 Jews, as it happened in Galicia, or 20,000 Jews, as happened in the Pale of Settlement, it creates real economic and social chaos, and the nobility themselves, who are still quite prominent and powerful, begin to complain. So we have the situation of the Tsar or the Emperor decreeing mass expulsions, uprooting Jews from the countryside from their taverns, and then thinking that maybe that wasn't such a good idea, and tolerating it in the end. It becomes semi-underground. In the Kingdom of Poland, it was a little different strategy, and this derives from Napoleonic genius, because Napoleon ruled over what became the Kingdom of Poland for 7 years. They derive a policy whereby they can raise the concession fees that only Jews pay to sell vodka yearly. And in that way, they squeeze Jews out of the liquor trade. And you can see it begins in 1415 with 17,561 Jewish families and dwindles to 2,329. The rest are projections. They squeeze Jews out of this liquor trade and squeeze out very nice profits at the same time. By 1844, they decided to outlaw Jewish tavern keeping in the countryside. This is the Tsarist regime. So no Jews are allowed to sell liquor anymore in the countryside. And by 1858, according to very impressive government statistics, the number of Jews selling liquor in the countryside in the Kingdom of Poland is 0. And historians have tended to accept these statistics at face value, and they've assumed the demise of Jewish tavern keeping by the mid-19th century. But case studies in the archives tell a completely different story. Despite the opposition of several powerful groups, government officials, Polish social reformers, even rabbis, Jewish tavern keepers survived underground. They survived continuing to run taverns in the countryside, thanks to the support of one group in particular, the very local Christians whom they were accused of exploiting and cheating. The local nobility encouraged their Jewish tavern keepers to merely install Christians as fronts to their taverns. In other words, the Christians would sell the liquor directly. And the Jew would continue his tavern-keeping responsibilities as always before, offering loans, advice, medical remedies, serving as the nobleman's banker, and of course supplying the liquor to the tavern as well. So what this means is the kingdom's largest service sector, the liquor trade, was underground, and local Christians tended to participate or simply keep quiet. The use of these Christian fronts was merely a continuation of a similar practice of employing Christians to keep taverns running on Sabbaths and holidays, which appears throughout the rabbinic literature. In order to circumvent Jewish religious law, tavern keepers would form fictitious partnerships with Gentiles. Rabbinic responsa, tshuvot, and codifications spell out the terms of these legal fictions. The Gentile must own 1/7 of the business, the equivalent to a Sabbath day. He has to buy into the partnership, but the Jew can actually loan him the money at very low interest rates to buy into the partnership. And the Gentile customers must come in on a Sabbath and demand, with a threat of violence, that the Jew serve him liquor. And that way, according to the rabbis, the taverns could run on Sabbaths and festivals. The whole thing was a hatzagah, as we say. And now these fictitious Christian partners were being used to circumvent state law, concession fees, and eventually outright bans in 1844. Now, the interesting thing is when they get caught, because that's what shows up in the archives. The nobles were forced to explain to government officials, remember now, this is a czarist-controlled regime that keeps the nobles in place as rulers at the local level. So the nobles now have to explain why they're continuing to employ Jews to run their taverns, despite the laws against this. According to one nobleman, Franciszek Kiszelnicki, as an owner of a roadside village who must always consider the convenience of travelers, I could not neglect to hire Jews who would continually provide for the needs of traveling Jews. In other words, you have all these traveling Jewish merchants coming throughout the countryside. They have to eat kosher. They need a place to stay and feel comfortable on Shabbat, etc. Most importantly, however, people of this faith, the Jews, show themselves to be sober. And this work requires sober and suitable people. And for this reason as well, I hired Jews. I tried with all my might to fulfill the will of the regime by not having Jews live there or actually sell the liquor. In this particular case, the Jewish tavern keepers are interrogated as well. They eventually admit that they were sort of running the taverns. These are 3 different villages we're talking about. But they were only doing so at the order of the nobleman to fulfill his commands. And they never directly sold liquor themselves. State officials were unmoved, and they expelled the Jews from these villages. But in one particularly interesting case, a petition is signed by the local Christians of the village of Kiszelnice, swearing that the Jewish tavern keeper there, Zelka Avigdorovich, never actually sold liquor. He merely helped out a little bit. And they promise to donate a large sum of money to the district court, the police court as they call it, as an affirmation of their honesty, of their oath. Essentially a bribe. This example of local Christians covering for the local Jewish tavern keeper, their neighbor, is particularly remarkable when we realize that the village of Kishelnitsa is less than 10 miles from the famous town of Jedwabne, where essentially later Polish Christians will turn on their Jewish neighbors and massacre them during the first years in 1941, first years of German occupation. Why all this support for the Jewish tavern keeper in the 19th century? Why not just lease taverns to rural Christians when it became illegal to lease them to Jews? It would be a lot more simple. Well, one reason was the perception of Jewish business acumen, Jewish business ability. But as Lord Kishelnitsky's response illustrates, a major factor in sustaining underground Jewish tavern keeping was the image of Jewish sobriety. Polish nobles believed that Jews did not drink, and that only Jews were sober enough to run their taverns profitably. And they would repeat this idea of Jewish sobriety like an article of faith. They didn't have many nice things to say about Jews, but one thing they would concede is Jews are not drunks. I've even seen Catholic sermons where the priest shames his congregation for drinking too much alcohol, for becoming drunks, and points out that this people, one people living among us, the Jews, they may have many faults, but a Jewish drunk, according to one priest, is hard to find. In fact, he goes on to say, if the Poles would become more like Jews in this regard, we would become a great nation once again. Drunkenness has brought us to our knees. Anti-Jewish polemics agreed, but they would give the Jewish sobriety idea a sinister twist, that Jews were remaining sober only to better cheat and swindle the innocent peasants. And Jewish literature, for its part, inverts the polemic and portrays the Gentile, the Goy, as a drunk. This charge appears everywhere from Yiddish folk songs, Shikers de Goy, to exalted poetry by Bialik, Avi, where he describes Gentile drunks rumbling around, cursing and vomiting, the invective pouring from their lips, as he clings to his father, the sober tavern keeper's knees, and listens to words, pure words of Torah flowing from his father's lips. So we have the liquid metaphors commingling in that way. These claims of Jewish sobriety are shocking to the historian of Hasidism. Hasidism, as you may know, has a rather tolerant attitude towards drinking. Some of this is based on the idea of worship through corporeality, avodah b'gashmiyut, the idea that many things, even mundane material pursuits, can become a vehicle for holiness, for worshiping God, and especially alcohol, because it creates a state of joy and ecstasy, perhaps artificially, but it can be used for proper purposes. And Hasidism's rivals were quick to condemn the movement on the basis that its adherents were drunks. The Mitnagdim, the traditionalist opponents of Hasidim, would describe Hasidic gatherings as basically drinking contests, days of drinking and joy. Each man grabbing his neighbor's neck and chanting and singing, "The rabbi ordered us to be joyful, so we must drink." Some Haskalah satires against Hasidism are extremely crude. They compete with Bialik in a way. portraying Hasidim as drunks, probably to paint them as sort of Gentiles, in effect. A more modest Haskalah satire that I found is something called Sefer HaTikun, which would translate as the laws of toasts. It pretends to be a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, which prescribes every moment where a pious Jew is supposed to make a toast. When he builds a house, when he sells a house, when his house burns down, when he celebrates a marriage, when he gets divorced, at the birth of a child, and during a yahrzeit, when he commemorates the death anniversary of a parent, when he greets a visitor, and so on. Of course, this would have kept the Chassid drinking all day long, and that's the humor of the satire. But the question is, how could a myth of Jewish sobriety coexist with these insider images of Hasidism as this at least robust drinking culture? And here we have another satire, and you'll notice the bottle in the Hasid's hand. We could dismiss the satires as an attempt to simply brand a movement that one did not agree with as being very un-Jewish, and therefore a culture of drunkenness. But passages in inner Hasidic sources actually sound a lot like Sefer HaTikun sometimes. These minhag books, these Hasidic books of customs, do actually prescribe various points where one should do a tikkun or l'chaim. Even on the death anniversary, yahrzeit, of one's parents or teachers, despite earlier rabbinic dicta to fast on those days, because according to these Hasidic sources, the presence of God does not dwell on sadness, but rather only on those who are joyful. I think there are differences between the Hasidic sources and the Haskalah satires. One difference is Hasidic sources contain warnings against excessive drinking. You're only supposed to drink during life cycle occasions, religious occasions. You're not allowed to recite blessings when you're drunk, only when you're buzzed, as we would say. But most importantly, when we examine the testimony of the heaviest Hasidic drinking, it's occurring mainly within exclusively Jewish and Hasidic spaces. In shtiblech, prayer houses, or in Hasidic courts. That is to say, outside of the non-Jewish public view. Hasidic drinking was rarely on display, the way Gentile drinking was on display in the Jewish-run taverns. And this helps Polish Jews preserve an image of sobriety, even during the rise of Hasidism. And I think it gives Jews in Poland a real sense of cultural superiority. I wouldn't dismiss these perceptions as complete fabrications. It does seem that Jewish alcoholism was less of a problem society-wide. You don't see it in the rabbinic sermons as much, the problem of drunkenness. You don't have temperance societies the way you do in Christian society. But these perceptions of Jewish sobriety are quite exaggerated. So how do we get from this situation of inter-ethnic coexistence to genocide? In his classic book, Ethnic Groups and Boundaries, the anthropologist Friedrich Barth argues that where two or more ethnic groups are in contact, they adapt to the situation by occupying clearly distinct economic niches so as not to compete over resources. They provide important goods and services for each other. The latter strategy seems to definitely apply in our case of the liquor trade. The nobles leased their liquor enterprises to Jews, whom they believed to be more industrious and sober. The peasants worked the land, and so on. However, according to Barth, where competition arises between these two groups, one group, usually the marginalized group, will be displaced. And the point at which we can identify this competition emerging between Jews and Christians, and the point at which this symbiotic relationship seems to break down, is in the wake of peasant emancipation in the early 1860s. This breakdown can actually be witnessed in a collection of kvitlach, or petitions, to a non-Hasidic miracle worker named Rabbi Eliyahu Gutmacher, the Tzaddik of Gretz, from the 1870s. So a decade after emancipation, we can start to see the effects. Now, the story of this collection is very interesting. These petitions, or kvitlach, were discovered in an attic in Gretz, or Grodzisk, and they were brought to the YIVO Institute in Vilna around 1932, and they just sat there unstudied. They were discovered by the Nazis during the occupation of Poland. Vilna was part of Poland in 1942, and they were brought over by Rosenberg to Frankfurt to be part of this future institute or museum to the deceased Jewish people. And what happens is the U.S. Army comes in and liberates these territories, discovers this collection. They don't really know what it is, but they bring it all to New York, where the YIVO Institute has been relocated. And these petitions, about 5,000 petitions, have sat there ever since, until a couple of years ago when I began to look through them. Now, while many of these petitions portray distress, they're petitions to a miracle worker, they also reflect certain advantages to the older system. For example, here's what some of these petitions look like. Many do reflect a continued coexistence with Christians. Things do not change overnight in the wake of peasant emancipation. One colorful petition in colloquial Yiddish is by Reb Zalman ben Gittel, the homeowner who is known as a great host and philanthropist. I observe the holy Sabbath, and the great merit will stand with me when the great Sabbath comes, and I will prepare for the Sabbath and festival this Thursday. I have a tavern and take care of things with 3 goyim, who are my right hand. One who lives there has the name Lipinski, and the other is named Kwiatkowski. And by mentioning the names of his Christian fronts, he seems to be asking Gutmacher to bless his Christian workers. A sign of continued coexistence. However, we also have signs of stresses and ruptures in the older system. Since nobles no longer owned all the land, they could no longer protect their Jewish lessees, their tavern keepers, from competition. Here's a petition by a female tavern keeper. The female widow, Pesa bat Hana, I come with a bitter spirit to the revered Admor, may he live, for several matters to ask his advice, since the mask of shame is on my face to travel to the Holy One, so I have put my request in writing. My principal means of livelihood is my liquor store, called a tavern. And thank God I had success in this business, but only for a period of 3 years, because another tavern was established here, because people saw my success and were envious of me, and they also established a tavern. As a result, my livelihood was diminished, so much that now the profits from the enterprise are only half of what they were before. Not only was tavern keeping less regulated by the 1870s by the nobility, but recently emancipated peasants could set up their own taverns. Menachem Moshe ben Fega for success in the tavern, and to repel the Gentile from there, who arose against the Jews and took their livelihood, so that the customers will not go to him, and that the scent of his drinks will stink, so that they could no longer stand his drinks, and to cause his downfall. For all the Jews and the widows and the orphans need this, for he took their livelihood. There was little to do now in the absence of the old monopolistic system where the nobility protected the Jews as a marginalized outgroup. They could no longer or would no longer do so. And that's why you have to turn to the tzaddik for help. Now, by the 1880s, improvements in steamship and rail transport permit a large influx of cheap grain coming from America and Russia to enter the Western European markets, and it devastates the already declining Polish grain trade, and it devastates the nobility. There's a huge drop in grain prices, and there's a full-blown agrarian crisis during which the nobility has to sell off its land, and many now go to the cities in search of somewhat dignified work. Jews not only lost their economic mainstays, they gained new competitors among these day-classed nobles, and they lost their most important protectors. In 1881, the first pogrom waves begin to snake their way across southern Russia, and few nobles could stand in their way. In 1898, the Polish nobility completely lost its monopoly on the sale and production of liquor. Anti-Jewish economic boycotts begin to appear at this time. First in major cities like Lodz and Warsaw, where the old system had the least traction and influence. According to Yedida Comfer, the anti-Jewish economic boycotts were a result of Polish nationalistic pride. Polish Catholics wanted to become economically self-sufficient, and the only solution they felt was to diminish the role of Jews and ethnic Germans in the Polish economy. Democracy and new freedom of the press in the wake of the 1905 revolution only increased the inter-ethnic strife because it allowed people to give voice and real power to these intergroup contests and animosities. In 1912, the Polish right in Warsaw organized a major boycott against Jews in retaliation for Jews having supported the less nationalistic Polish candidate for the Duma. And the Polish nationalist press in Warsaw called for an economic struggle against Jews under the slogan of each for his own, swój do swego. Polish workers began organizing themselves into economic cooperatives based on the idea that it was cheaper for several families to purchase goods in bulk than through the Jewish middleman. In Lodz, the Catholic priest Andrzej Rogozinski encouraged the cooperative movement as the best means of waging an economic war against Jews, and he urged workers not to buy from Jews anymore. The workers, he later wrote, became convinced that they didn't need to kill Jews or torture them, but rather they could struggle in a noble and higher fashion worthy of a civilized people, and by that means to take trade and industry out of Jewish hands and into their own. Father Rogozinski became known ironically as the Moses of Lodz. He would lead the Poles to the promised land of economic independence from Jews. Similar cooperatives and boycotts were organized in towns and villages throughout Poland. By the late 1930s, these anti-Jewish boycotts were beginning to have an impact. Bands of anti-Jewish zealots would invade the marketplaces and picket storefronts, urging Poles not to do business with Jews. Christian businesses posted signs outside their stores attesting to their Aryan owners. Newspapers began posting announcements intended to shame any Poles who were seen purchasing products from Jews. They would actually post announcements in the newspapers. And enforcers would destroy Jewish stalls in the marketplaces. In Białystok, where Jews had owned 92% of the stores and stalls in 1932, the proportion dropped to 62% in 1937 and dipped below 50% the very next year. And at this time, pogroms broke out, beginning in 1936, in 150 towns throughout Poland. But it was the German and Soviet invasions of Poland in 1939 that destroyed the remnants of any economic-based coexistence. In the German occupational zone, Jews were confined to ghettos, of course, and severed economically from their Polish neighbors, with the sole exception of smuggling. The town of Jedwabne, which was under Soviet occupation, actually I thought we changed the date. This should be 1941. Illustrates the most drastic effects. After the Germans took control July 10th, 1941, a group of Polish men from around Jedwabne and neighboring settlements rounded up their male Jewish neighbors, took them to the town square, and attacked them and beat them, and forced them to demolish and remove a statue of Lenin that had been erected by the Soviets. Next, they took the remaining Jews of Jedwabne, estimated around 300, containing many women and children, locked them inside a barn and burned them alive. As mentioned earlier, this town of Jedwabne was situated less than 10 miles from Kishelnica, the village where a century earlier local Christians had rallied around their Jewish neighbor to prevent his expulsion. But we see the older networks of intercommunal engagement had disintegrated. Scholars studying other geopolitical regions have witnessed similar cases of interethnic coexistence and violence. Ashutosh Varshney contrasts two towns in India, Hyderabad and Lucknow. Both towns contained dominant Hindu and large minority Muslim communities. Hyderabad experienced 8 violent anti-Muslim riots during the 1930s, while Lucknow was essentially peaceful. The main difference, argues Varshney, is that Lucknow's economic mainstay was embroidered textiles produced by Muslim tailors, Muslim printers, Muslim embroiderers, and sold via Muslim agents, but sold and distributed throughout the region by Hindu traders. In other words, there was an economic symbiosis. Communal conflicts like those occurring in Hyderabad would have caused Lucknow's symbiotic system to collapse and would have threatened the entire local economy. One can only imagine a scenario where local Hindus in Lucknow decided they no longer needed the local Muslims and decided to take the embroidered textile trade into their own hands. The effects probably would have been quite destabilizing. In our case, a more complex system of Jewish liquor lessees, Christian noble owners of liquor monopolies, and Christian peasant customers endured down to the end of the 19th century, despite being based on quite exaggerated perceptions of Jewish sobriety and business acumen. In the end, such perceptions were undercut by peasant competition in the wake of emancipation, noble impoverishment, and the rise of a form of Polish economic nationalism that saw economic independence from all perceived outsiders as a kind of redemption after a humiliated century of occupation by Russia, Prussia, and Austria. Marginalizing Jews economically became a matter of national pride. When marginalization gave way to complete exclusion from the economy during the Nazi occupation, the result could be catastrophic for the Jewish minority, even without active Nazi participation. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Professor Dynner, for a fascinating talk, that wonderful moment in which Hasidic drinking, which was viewed from the inside as drunkenness and from the outside as sobriety, reminds me of something my late father wrote on Purim, which is the sort of Jewish carnival the Jewish answer to Lent. But when you compare the two, it's really a parody on Lent, because the drinking and there's no violence there and so on and so forth. So the Christian carnival and the Jewish carnival, when viewed from the inside or outside, give that wonderful dialectic. The floor is open to questions you can ask in Hebrew, ask in English, and if I know Glenn, you can ask in Polish and Yiddish.
You were talking about the taverns in the countryside. Were also Jewish taverns in the cities? This is one question. The other one is, before World War II, did the ban, was the ban lifted about Jewish taverns in the country?
Okay, thank you. So the interesting thing is, yes, Jewish tavern keeping remains legal in urban areas, that's to say in towns and cities, for rather high concession fees. So it was legal but often prohibitively expensive. There were many fewer Jewish taverns in towns because there were many fewer towns. Every town was surrounded by a whole group of satellite villages. Each one would have its own tavern, also on all the country roads leading to the towns and so on. So there were many, many more village taverns. I forget what the ratio was, but I once calculated it. I think I recall it was something like 4-to-1, the ratio. The most important thing, though, more than the quantity, was the qualitative significance, because village taverns came to be symbols. They came to be a symbol of the peasant who's hopelessly drunk and taken advantage of by the Jews. So that becomes the trope in the anti-Semitic literature, which is why I concentrate much more on the rural taverns than the ones in the towns. Interestingly enough, it's never completely outlawed in the towns. The ban against Jewish tavern keeping is lifted with the Polish Republic in 1918. The Polish Minorities Treaty allows for it. However, in the late 1930s, the Polish government begins passing laws specifically prohibiting Jews from selling liquor once again. What I find, the more I study these cases, is that the legislation mattered a little bit, but it didn't matter a lot. Everybody finds a way around this legislation. And as long as it's felt that Jews are necessary, and this is felt in the countryside much longer than in cities like Lodz and Warsaw, as long as Jews are considered necessary, there's a way around the legislation. Everybody finds a way.
מה שיעור היהודים שלא הסתגלו למצב הכלכלי החדש שנבע מהשינויים החוקיים של סוף המאה ה-19 והמאה ה-20 ושנאלצו בעקבות זאת ושעזבו בעקבות זאת את פולין?
This is very difficult to record in terms of statistics because everything is underground. So what this means is that we have a situation whereby it seems to historians that the Jews have all left this trade, but social commentators are saying something almost completely different. That everywhere, on every roadside, taverns are being run by Jews, despite the laws, despite the legislation. So we have 0 in terms of the government statistics, and we have 100% in terms of people's perceptions, the perceptions of the social reformers. So with emigration from Poland, it seems that there is a steep decline, and this emigration occurs really beginning in the 1880s. There is a steep decline in Jewish involvement in the liquor trade. But it's hard to say what the cause of that decline is, because genealogists keep coming to me with proof that their grandparents ran taverns in the old country. They have documents, they have memoirs, they have diary accounts. And yet again, if you go by the statistics, Jews have abandoned this trade almost completely. It's outlawed by the Polish government in the interwar period. So again, you have a situation, either it's zero or it's many, many, many Jews running taverns. What I would say is my impression has to be that it declines significantly because the Polish Republic actually is very liberal economically. This is the first time we forget that Jews are emancipated. They can go into many different branches of trade. On the other hand, the mythology and the old relationships between Jews and tavern keepers don't disappear. And the smaller towns and villages, they seem to remain intact as far as I can tell.
Thank you, Glenn, for a truly masterful both synthesis and analysis that shows the many complex factors that bear on interethnic and Jewish and Catholic relations in Poland. I have a question of a specific moment, which is this moment when the when the Jewish tavern keeper goes underground, because not only does he go underground, but you claim that it has a sort of a real importance in maintaining social cohesion within, or between the various non-Jewish groups, but particularly be sort of potential class conflicts, as I heard you. And what struck me is that there's an assumption that inter-ethnic economic cooperation usually works best, particularly in highly conflictual situation, when there is an independent arbiter, say the rule of law or some third party that can adjudicate potential disputes. But we actually have very few studies of what happens, in contraband or in underground type of economies, because those, they leave very little paper trail, as you say. So here you have a situation, if I understand, in which not only Jews operate illegally, but they have a lot of agreements, implicit, probably long-term credit with these Christians who come and go, and they may repay or not. And they also have all sorts of social mediation functions. And all that happens in a moment when they're very fragile because they don't seem to have any protection from the law. So I'm just curious, because I think it has very broad implications for other cases about the idea. We think that the state is what has to arbitrate between people who would otherwise fight. And I mean, I'm sympathetic. I have myself worked on other cases in which the state is very weak, and different ethnic groups actually find ways of not assimilating, not merging, not becoming particularly friends, but to have this sort of contained conflict. So I was wondering whether you could elaborate a little.
So where is the state in this, what I described as a triangular relationship between Jews, nobles, and peasants? The state is an intruder. The nobleman still seems to believe, long after the partitions of Poland, that he has the right to run his enterprises on his estates the way he wants to, without interference by the state. The nobility does not seem fully aware that Poland is no more. The state is actually a colonial power. I mean, Poland-Lithuania really is a colonized situation, which not many people realize because we associate colonization with places like India, where there are clear distinctions, great empires and so on. This is a situation of colonization. What does that mean? It means that there's a deep ambivalence towards the state. I'm really tempted to think of the police in the United States today, in major cities, as we've seen, where you go to them when you're in trouble, but you also see them as a kind of persecuting force, very tense relationships. getting in the way of communities rather than safeguarding those communities. It's an ambivalent relationship to the state. So what do I see? The state passes laws that you can no longer have Jews run your taverns. And you say, well, now I'm definitely going to have Jews run my tavern. You can't tell me what to do on my own estate. Paradoxically, this seems to create a cohesion between Jews and local Christians. They're in on it together against this alien state that doesn't even seem to speak their language. On the other hand, when anybody feels wronged in the situation, they appeal to the state as an outside arbitrator. That's why we have these case studies. The only reason that Lord Kishelnitsky and his Jewish tavern keepers got caught is because another Jew had been pushed out of the lease. Actually, it seems like he'd been getting drunk and disorderly. And so the nobleman canceled his contract, brought another Jew. What does that former Jewish tavern keeper do? He goes immediately to the state and complains. They're running this tavern, these whole networks of taverns illegally, and therefore asking the state to intervene. So it's this very ambivalent kind of relationship. One thing that I've become sure of, and that is that the best case, the most utopian situation of inter-ethnic cooperation is among criminals, is on the black market. That's where nobody cares what nationality you are, what religion you are, and it really requires very intensive inter-ethnic communication and mutual respect in order to carry off a transnational operation like smuggling, or once we have ghettos with the German occupation of Poland, across ghetto walls where it's, it could be the death penalty, if you're caught. That seems to be the optimum scenario for inter-ethnic cooperation and coexistence.
Thank you, Glenn. It was really very, very fascinating, your presentation. Thank you. In some ways, your talk expanded what we heard yesterday from Yoav Pellet's presentation in relation to the economic crisis and the rise of hatred and anti-Semitism. Okay, and I would like to ask you to look a little bit prior to the emancipation of the peasants, and you, as we can understand, the taverns were like a meeting point for both societies or both religious groups. On the one hand, we have the Jews, and then the peasants are coming to as clients. And I wonder, it's on the one hand, the Jews felt a little bit superior to the peasants. On the other hand, it's a very ambivalent situation when the peasants are the majority and the people of the land, and definitely looked at the Jews as the minority and the weaker minority. I know if I compare it to another place where I worked on, in Yemen, for example, something very similar of the Jews and Muslims, interaction was made in workshops, not in taverns, but in workshops, where the Jews gave giving services to the Muslim communities. Many times the workshop was a meeting place for Muslims and Jews. I didn't hear from your talk any other than selling and buying there with Christians and Jews, aside from those front partnerships that you mentioned. Was there anything else that can be?
Right.
you know, we can see it from the little to enlarge the circle of social interactions.
So it's interesting because the temptation is to say that we have Polish Jewish history all wrong, that actually there was a great deal of social discourse going on, and I do see it on occasion, but it's not the norm. I don't think we're talking about a situation of social integration. I want to be very clear about this. This is not integration. This is interaction within heavily prescribed roles. That means that the Jew is either a traveling merchant, that means he's come from a different town, sometimes very far away, so he's a stranger, or he's running the tavern, he's selling the liquor. And the peasant is usually local, always local. And the nobleman, you know, it depends, but he's in a different category himself. We occasionally will see conversations. The problem with conversations is they sometimes approach theological issues. And when there's the theological discussion, it comes to my God is better than your God. And for Jews, these conversations can actually be deadly. They can lead to imprisonment and even death. There are social taboos within each community against intermarriage, against mixing, even against friendship, I've seen. There's great suspicion, and they're trying to maintain boundaries. So I think it's very important that we not go too far. What I will say is that the tavern keeper becomes a kind of friend to the community. You go to the tavern keeper, the Jew, when you need advice, whether it's business advice, marriage, matchmaking advice, medical remedies, help dealing with the nobleman. The Jewish tavern keeper does become an important advisor in that capacity. But I think the bar is the dividing point, with the Jew standing on one side and the Gentile standing on the other. And so I avoid any utopian or even modern notions of integration when I'm talking about these scenarios. The boundaries are very marked.
Glenn, can I add
Yes, please.
two very, very brief questions of my own? You painted a very vivid picture, not a snapshot, but really a dynamic of social, economic, and political change. You said very little about the religious context and the clergy. I mean, were the clergy throwing oil on the flames like we experience today? What was happening on both sides from that point of view? And the other thing I'm very curious about, and I think we actually talked about this in 2010 a little, the tavern itself as an institution, it sounds very Carlo Ginzburg-y, sitting on the crossroads. It's within and it's without, and then the Jew sort of occupies the miller's classical role as being suspicious yet needed, and so on and so forth. And there's a social dynamic there, I think, as well. Yeah. So a word about that and about the religious context.
Okay. So the interesting thing I recommend to anyone who hasn't read it is in the autobiography of Solomon Maimon, which paints a very vivid and detailed picture of life in the Polish countryside. His grandfather runs a tavern, at least the entire village, in fact. And there is a local priest who comes there and drinks there every day. And the problem is he doesn't feel that he needs to pay his tab. He's a priest. He should be able to drink for free. One day, Maimon's grandfather attempts to collect on all the debts. And the result, after a series of conflicts, is a blood libel accusation against Maimon's grandfather, fomented by this resentful priest. Now, did this really happen? Some scholars have actually doubted. They think it's an exaggeration or even just a legend. But the point is, the clergy are friendlier to alcohol than we might imagine. And where else are they going to drink it? They're drinking it in the Jewish-run tavern. However, there's a point of friction there that can be quite dangerous. Interestingly enough, the clergy become the main threat to the entire business because they're founding these temperance movements in the mid-19th century, where a married couple, a newlywed couple, has to take an oath they will never touch vodka. This becomes a direct threat to Jewish livelihood. So Jews are very much against these temperance movements, and these temperance movements wind up taking a very anti-Semitic angle. And they fail. And guess who gets blamed for their failure? Not the peasants who return to drinking, but rather the Jews who, in cahoots with the government, managed to stamp out the temperance movement. The point is again a very ambivalent kind of a situation. Now, you mentioned Ginsburg and the Miller, and I wouldn't even go as far as Miller's. I would look at other tavern keepers in other countries and lands. You do see a similar kind of on the border situation. They're mediating between the outside world and local life. They're situated on the boundaries of the local and the foreign. But there's a difference here, because it's Jews. And I know I've gone to great pains to stress how the essentialism argument is not valid. But when Jews are involved in this insider-outsider status, selling this intoxicating, addictive substance, it has an extra kick to it. It invests the whole scenario with new meaning, with added suspicion, perhaps grudging admiration that Jews are part of this world and yet part of the other world too, but it's different. So I would almost emphasize the contrast rather than the similarities, because tavern keepers everywhere are suspect. We see this in studies of British tavern keepers, Italian tavern. They're always suspected as not being quite of our local life because they meet so many strangers and they're exposed to so many foreign ideas and so on. There's always a suspicion against the tavern keeper. But when it's a Jewish tavern keeper, the suspicions are that much more intense.
Thank you, Glenn, for letting us enter into your personal tavern and your surprising drinks. I have two questions. One of them relates to your last comment about, and the beginning of your talk about essentialism. You distance yourself from other scholars like Sloskin, and I wonder, it seems to me that you are closer to their approach than you might admit, because Sloskin, as far as I remember, did emphasize the place of Jews as strangers or minorities, ethnic and religious, that constitute themselves economical place. And he also gave, if I remember correct, Lebanese in South America and Germans in Russia. And it seems to me that that's your, let's say, meta-narrative, that Jews were an ethnic and religious minority, which gave them this specific place in economy, or in the specific example of tavern keepers. That's one question. And another question, more specific, relates to Hasidism. How, maybe you can explain a little bit, what do you think about what is the specific relation between Hasidic life and alcohol? Because there are other characteristics like smoking, and maybe thinking about Moshe Ida's recent studies about the Carpathian context of mutual influences. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit about what's specific in Hasidism that relates to alcohol. Thank you.
Okay, just to differentiate myself from Slezkin, Slezkin is offering Jews as a kind of ideal type. They're different somehow intrinsically. He never explains why Jews constantly occupy this semi-outsider status. What I've been trying to show is it's really much more due to historical context and to perceptions. That is to say, if you put a group in that situation where you project all these ideas onto that group and you offer them opportunities that agree with all those projections, you're going to create that group in a certain sense. You're going to make that group the way they are. I think that's very different from saying that Jews are intrinsically one way or another, intrinsically clever and adaptable and agile. That sounds to me very much like Zombard. Okay, so does that make sense? We're talking about the difference between historical context, the situation that arises, versus some sort of biological, or he doesn't really say biological, but he implies some sort of natural proclivity that Jews seem to have. This idea, I think, needs to be overcome. It's just not helpful. Now, with respect to Hasidism and drinking, I think that there is a special relationship between Hasidism and drinking, precisely because the material world is viewed in a very different way by the first Hasidic thinkers. Something not to be avoided, but rather to be embraced. You know, as Rivka Schatz-Uvenheimer and others have shown, the whole notion of avodah b'gashmiut, worship through corporeality, is that you embrace the material world, you use it for holy purposes, rather than avoiding it. So alcohol is going to lend itself to that. And yet it doesn't become exactly like the Gentile drinking that we see in the surrounding culture. In Moshe Idel's article, he refers to one case where the Baal Shem Tov outdrinks the Romanian peasant. And that's the miracle. By focusing on God, he's able to control his liquor. And this is apparently the strongest liquor that's ever been seen before. But to even have to state that as a miracle shows that there are certain expectations and cultural norms in Jewish society that Hasidim did not completely overturn. You don't see drinking bouts, contests, in order to display masculinity. These drinking bouts in Gentile culture could be very public and very almost like performances. You do not see that to the same extent in the Hasidic court. It seems like it's much more attached to a specific function, a toast for a specific event, something of religious significance. That could be seen as an excuse to just drink a lot, but the effect seems to somehow be different. But I think the most important thing to remember about Hasidic drinking is that the Rebbes, the tzaddikim, they really do try to regulate it. They try to control it. They try to say that a little bit is okay, but not a lot. And that's something I just haven't seen in the Gentile literature in a comparative sense.
What one gets in the Hasidic literature is a notion which is this is where Mitnagdim and Hasidim really divided, is that dveikut, okay, has to come accompanied with a transcending, not merely of the body, but of the mind itself. Okay, so I think Baal Shem Tov himself talks about latzet min hashura, okay, in the sense of acting crazy, of transcending one's rationality. And this is where drink may help in the way smoking that you were referring to doesn't. But, you know, these aren't bouts of drunkenness, but as you said, a kind of buzz which allows you to act crazy. The Baal Shem Tov was actually known for acting crazy. And we get this all along, I think, in Hasidim, which is an interesting twist to the story you tell, I think. I'd like to thank Professor Glenn Dynner for a wonderful, wonderful talk.